good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for our experimental results webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about our new journal, Experimental Results, with an environmental science perspective. We're going to have a panel discussion, and I'll introduce you to our panelists shortly, followed by a Q&A. So before we begin, there's just a little bit of housekeeping. So you've all joined today's webinar in listen-only mode. So that means that you can hear us, but you can't actually speak to us. However, there is a chat panel, which you should see at the bottom of your screen, where you can submit questions. You can send questions in for the Q&A at the end, so please do that. We'd love to hear your questions. And equally, if you have any kind of technical problems or audio or anything like that, just let us know and we'll see how we can help with that too. If we're unable to get through all your questions today in the Q&A, then we will send round them at the end out with the email that comes with the recording of the webinar in the next couple of days. In the unlikely event that we experience any major technical problems, we will end the webinar and then restart it. But hopefully that shouldn't happen and it will all go nice and smoothly. So yeah, to summarise, you'll get a recording of this webinar in the next 2 days. You can submit your questions at any time, and you'll also receive a survey at the end to let us know how useful you found it and another chance to ask us any more questions. So introducing our panelists today, we have Dr. Fiona Hutton, who is our Executive Publisher and Head of STM Open Access Publishing at Cambridge University Press, Alison Paskins, who is our Publishing Editor at Cambridge University Press, and we are joined by Dr. Jennifer Pollack, who is our Chief Editor for Environmental Science, and Dr. Benjamin Wolfer, who is our experimental results author, speaking today. So a really great panel. We should have a really good discussion and get into the grit of experimental results and what it means for this field of research. And to start, I'm going to hand over to Fiona.
Great. Thank you very much, Abby. So I'm Fiona Hutton. I'm the head of STM Open Access Publishing at the Press and an executive publisher. And I just thought it would be helpful for us to kind of lay out the background about why we actually launched something like experimental results and what our thinking around that was. So I'm going to take you through some thoughts on the journey of what a researcher would be. So here we are, a journey of a researcher. The first thing that you do as a researcher, you decide that you go into science because you absolutely love science. You study your degree, you go on to do your PhD. Finally, as a PhD, you're a scientist, you feel very happy with yourself. You get to indulge in all the exciting experiments in your subject area that you've chosen. As you do that, you get lots of unexpected results. Some results are clear and you can follow a particular pathway, but often, and I'm speaking from experience because I used to be a researcher, you get lots of unexpected results that kind of fill up your lab notebook. That you could choose some directions and not choose other directions. What happens next is that sometimes that research makes sense, but sometimes it doesn't make sense, and you can't create a narrative for it to be published in your journal of choice. But actually, what it is your results are actually valid. You've carried out your research properly. It just doesn't necessarily fit into a particular narrative that a normal research paper would do. So what happens next? You feel that you're a failure. And this kind of goes back and forth. Sometimes you might get success, you might be able to publish your fantastic paper in a journal, but then there's actually lots and lots of research that doesn't make it into that particular pathway. And often what happens at that point is many scientists feel like they're a failure because they spend an awful lot of time doing this research and those results are hidden. So why do you actually do science? And we asked a number of people, why did you get into science? These are some of the answers that we had. One, to push forward knowledge. I want to solve climate change and ensure the world is a sustainable place to live. I'm excited by new discoveries. I'm just damn curious. I want to solve problems. I want to cure disease X. Often you find in the biological sciences that people get into particular areas because there's something happens in their family or their life that makes them want to be in a particular area. Not because I want to do science to get paper in journal X and hopefully get the Nobel Prize. But surprisingly, or not surprisingly, I'm guessing by the audience, this is something that gets repeated quite a lot when you're doing research. And actually, a lot of early career researchers feel like, you know, they're a failure because they're not following that particular path, or as yet anyway. So why do they feel that failure? They feel a failure because reward is for the first to report a finding over those that are second, those who report a positive result and not a negative one, and those results that fit into the narrative required of a standard research paper. So what happens to such research findings? They're mostly hidden in your lab notebooks, hidden because you chose to take a different path because actually the results, you know, it would be more impactful, but actually the results that you have are not necessarily invalid. They're just not something that you would necessarily publish. So from our perspective, we were thinking about this as publishers, and we were thinking, well, it shouldn't all be about trying to get research into that really high impact journal. How do we actually change the dial and actually think about producing a research communication that actually fills gaps of knowledge rather than just contains eye-catching, impactful research? So our idea was to come up with a collaborative and open pathway for research. We want to capture those messy, inconclusive, and incremental steps that make up research. We want to share negative and null results. We don't want to contrive the experimental result to fit a particular narrative. We want it to be driven by open, and by open, I mean open research. So that includes open access, publishing open access, linking to open data, having open and signed peer reviews so that everything that is published is transparent. And we also want to recognize DORA, for those of you who don't know, is a declaration of research assessment. And it recognizes that hiring, promotion, and funding decisions should focus on the qualities of research that are most desirable: insight, impact, reliability, and reusability. And a lot of universities have now signed up for this, and they want to recognize their researchers for publishing, not just publishing, but doing research in that way. So our idea is to come up with experimental results. And experimental results is really what we see as an innovative open access, open peer review journal, providing researchers with a venue to publish all experimental findings from all STM disciplines. So that journal is gold open access, publishes standalone research findings. It doesn't have to be, you know, 5 or 6 different pieces of research put together as a paper. Those results of any particular experiment are valid on their own, containing open peer review as standard, including null, negative, and novel results. And also, because of the way that they're produced, others can replicate those research easily, helping to resolve the reproducibility crisis. And we have many subject areas across STM represented, which you can see at the bottom. So I'm going to pass on now to Alison Paskins. And Ali is both manages and is the publishing editor for experimental results, and she'll talk to you about more in detail about the journal.
Hello. So yes, as Fiona said, I'm the publishing editor for experimental results at Cambridge University Press. So today I'm going to tell you a bit more about the publishing processes for the journal and where we are with the journal so far. So as you can see from this slide, we've appointed more than 200 team members so far across a range of roles. So chief editors, reviewing editors, editorial boards, statistical editors, and social media editors from more than 40 countries. So it's clear that people across the globe are recognizing experimental results as an initiative that they would like to be involved in. which is great. We've already published 40 papers in the journal, 2 of which are under the Earth and Environmental Science subject category, and we've seen more than 100 submissions covering all of the 8 broad subject categories. These numbers demonstrate that the journal resonates with many and that it is an attractive publication venue. We've included here an example of one of our psychology and psychiatry papers, which has an altmetric score of 145. It was picked up by 15 news outlets, 1 blog, and has seen 33 tweets. So this is just a sign of how well some of the papers are doing. So the next couple of slides give an overview of the environmental science team for experimental results. We have Jenny, who will be speaking shortly, who's the chief editor for the section. So Jenny has been helping us to appoint the team, but also is responsible for directing the scientific quality and advising on direction of the section. We also have several reviewing editors. So we have 7 from the USA, 2 from Europe, and 2 from Asia. Reviewing editors are responsible for managing the peer review process and making decisions on papers. We also have Danielle, who's the social media editor, who's also from the USA. Danny manages the environmental science side of the journal's Twitter account. We're still growing the editorial board for the environmental science section, and this just gives an example of some of the members we have so far. The editorial board is responsible for reviewing papers on request by the reviewing editors. So this slide gives a few of the testimonials that we've seen from authors so far. So we have Terry Palmer, who noted that experimental results is a great avenue to publish results that are important, but not extensive enough for a full journal article, and that he was able to quickly transform the results of a small study into a citable publication. We also had Andre Luis Souza dos Santos, who noted that it's a great initiative from Cambridge University Press, and that negative results are significant approaches. So their divulgation will permit that other groups do not repeat or replicate these experiments. And we also heard from Punit Shah, who noted that experimental results is a brilliant idea, and that there's a growing number of open access journals with transparent review processes, but that experimental results stood out given the priority for short papers reporting on small chunks of data. So as Fiona mentioned, experimental results operates an open peer review process, providing full transparency about decision making to fit in with the open culture of the journal. Open peer review helps to mitigate issues that contribute to editorial bias and enables reviewers to collect their contributions as part of their academic record. Authors know who has reviewed their submission, with accepted manuscripts being published with their review reports. These reports include the reviewer name, their ORCID ID, and are assigned an individual DOI. We feel that revealing identities of reviewers increases transparency, and that reviewers can therefore be held accountable for their evaluations. It has been found out that this often leads to a higher review in terms of tone and quality, with less instances of reviewer bias, as conflicts of interest can be identified by the community. And by publishing the review reports along with the reviewer names, and also by assigning them a DOI, makes them citable research outputs, ensuring that reviewers receive recognition and have an up-to-date CV of all areas of their work. So experimental results is a slightly different review format. We aim to have a very fast peer review process to ensure that research is published as quickly as possible. To facilitate this, we set up a scorecard for reviewers to complete, rather than asking for the lengthy review summary that journals traditionally ask for. Experimental results requires a minimum of 2 reviews per paper. The scorecard asks the reviewer to assess the paper on the quality of the experiment, rather than judging the impact of the results. The reviewers need to answer yes to the following 3 questions in order for the paper to be assessed suitable for publication. Is the experiment reported scientifically sound? Are the controls used in the experiment valid? And are the experimental methods well designed? The reviewer also answers a series of questions under 3 sections: presentation, context, and analysis, ranking their answers from 1 poor to 5 excellent. The questions in each section are weighted according to importance, and this is taken into account for the calculation of the overall section score out of 5. So experimental results aims to progress the scientific field forwards, providing the opportunity for all sound experimental results to be published, regardless of how novel or how high impact they are. We recognise that we're currently in a reproducibility crisis with duplicate research being undertaken globally, and we are hoping that experimental results will play a part in reducing this. We believe that experimental results is a journal run by the scientific community for the benefit of the community. The editorial team itself is large and growing, and we recognise that with such a large team, there is a risk that members can feel one of many and not heavily involved with the journal itself. So we're working as much as we can to ensure that this isn't the case. All of the team have had the opportunity to receive a promotional materials pack and to join both full team and subject group webinars, which has seen lively discussions around how to improve the journal, increase its visibility, and provide for each broad subject category effectively. We continually welcome feedback from team members on how to improve and enhance the journal, and we implement these recommended changes wherever possible. All team members receive a bi-monthly newsletter, which gives an update on how the journal is doing and any highlights. We've already made adjustments to ensure that experimental results provides for each of the subject areas it covers, such as having subject-specific instructions for authors where needed. We also fully recognise the importance of good reviewers to the success of a journal. Editorial board members are expected to review up to 5 papers each year. In addition to the recognition that reviewers receive through open peer review, we are offering reviewers discounts on article processing charges for submitted papers. Authors who have carried out a peer review will be able to claim a £150 discount on the APC, up to a maximum of 2 peer reviews, so a maximum discount of £300. We are also keen for experimental results to provide for early career searchers as much as possible, with many early career researchers being team members already. We are currently working on setting up initiatives to help early career researchers with reviewing, such as peer review mentoring and peer review and author workshops. So that's it from me, but I'll now pass over to Jenny, who will explain a bit more what experimental results means for the environmental science area.
Thank you, Ali. Hello, everyone. Unfortunately, I'm getting a message from my computer that my internet is unstable, so I'm going to go ahead and give my presentation without turning on my webcam. So I'd like to talk a little bit, well, first of all, I serve in the role as the chief editor for the environmental science topic area at Experimental Results. And I'd like to talk first a little bit about the benefits of experimental results within the field of environmental science. So picking up on a little bit of what Fiona and Ali have already said, we know, a lot of us know anyway, that the publishing record is notorious for having positive bias. You know, the papers that are published and the papers that are being cited a lot are those papers that have a hypothesis that was tested and the results were expected, or the results came out to be as expected. And we only hear about these so-called unexpected results or failed experiments or negative results when we're talking to colleagues at conferences or talking online, or, you know, just sort of in informal conversations. So these results are not being captured. This venue now, this new journal, Experimental Results, really seeks to allow us to capture these important findings so that they can be more widely shared across the discipline. In this way, not only is the scientific record more balanced, but it's also more honest. So we recognize the importance of publishing studies that work, as well as studies that had results that were contrary to those that were expected. Personally, in my field, which is restoration ecology, This is a field where we're really learning by doing, and we're trying to restore habitats in new systems using new methods. But oftentimes we're looking to our colleagues in similar systems across the globe to see what they've done and whether it did or did not work. And this is true really across all scientific disciplines, where we want to be good stewards of the scientific funding that we obtain. So whether it be funding from public or private dollars, experimental results allows us to be good stewards of this funding by providing a platform to share small data sets or unexpected results that would not necessitate a traditional length manuscript. So one of the frequently asked questions that I get as the chief editor for the environmental science section is, what should an experimental results paper look like? So I'd like to take a couple of minutes just to step through what a publication at experimental results looks like. So this is, as you can see, what we've designed to show sort of an anatomy of an experimental results paper in the environmental science section. So I think this question that's coming from a lot of interested potential authors is understandable, because we're all very conditioned to the traditional journal format. But when you think about it, and hopefully when you look at this anatomy of an experimental results paper, you can see that in many ways the traditional journal format can be limiting to sharing these small data sets or unexpected results. So here, looking at this this first page of one of our recently published articles, the first thing I want to point out here is that there's a word limit of 2,000 words for all sections. This doesn't include the references, and there's a slightly longer word limit for mathematics, statistics, and probability of 3,000 words. But in Earth and Environmental Science, the word limit is 2,000. As you can see along the top here, Earth and Environmental Science is highlighted as the broad subject area, because experimental results does publish manuscripts from a broad variety of scientific disciplines. You can see here the results type was negative result. So right away as a reader, you can determine what kind of paper you're going to be looking at here. The authorship is tied to your ORC ID, so it's easy to track this publication as one in your portfolio. You can see that we have a short abstract that is required, so 150 words maximum. We have 3 to 5 keywords that are required, and then you can see here that we have an introduction section that looks just like any real traditional journal format, except that it's quite a bit shorter. So instead of having maybe several pages of introduction, this is a short paragraph of introduction to the data set. Moving forward here, you can see again that this is really familiar in terms of the way that you would write this paper, except that we're really striving for brevity here. So we're not trying to take a traditional format paper and wedge it into experimental results. We are really trying to publish data sets that necessitate a shorter form narrative. So here you can see we have a mandatory methods section, mandatory results section, and again, these are each about a paragraph in length. This particular paper does have a short discussion section, which is supplemented here by a number of figures. For experimental results, you can have a maximum of 4 figures, and of course, multi-panel figures are okay, as you can see here and on the next page as well. I will mention here that you are allowed and encouraged to provide supplementary material. So if there were additional tables or less important figures that also helped to supplement the narrative, those would be accepted as supplemental material. You can see here that the conclusions is our final mandatory section for inclusion in the text, and some of our authors have been combining their discussion and conclusion into this section, and again, you can see it's on the order of a paragraph. Another required section that we have here is your funding, as well as the data availability statement. So this is really important for experimental results. We're trying to publish data and narratives that supplement that data set. We're trying to get both the narrative into an open access format so that it's available, but we also feel very strongly about the data as well. So it is required that authors share where the data have been made available. You can see that those are noted here. We do not require that the data are archived in a specific data management site or data archiving location, but we do require that the data are shared and that availability is made clear. As I mentioned earlier, you can see here that authors can upload supplementary material if they feel that, you know, maybe there's an additional figure or table that's required to supplement the text. Here you can see traditional reference section. Again, the references are not included in that 2,000 word limit. And then if we go ahead just one more page, we can take a peek at what the open review process looks like. So you can see here that the final page of any manuscript that's published with experimental results will be accompanied by this open peer review page. So the handling reviewing editor is named here. All of the reviewer names are made available. There are statements here about how the article was accepted. So we do have statistical editors on staff, such that if the statistics are in question, it is sent to the statistical editor for review and vetting that the statistics are appropriate and valid. The reviews themselves are given a DOI. And then you can see that there are conflict of interest statements for the reviewers as well. On the bottom of the page here, each review is accompanied by this weighted score that Ali was talking about. So the reviewers are going to rank each paper based on 3 categories. So number 1, the presentation out of a score of 5, context out of a score of 5, and then there we go. And then finally, an analysis. So we really here are not asking questions about the novelty of the research. We're asking about, is this a solid, valid scientific study and a contribution to the scientific record? So I'll stop here in terms of describing the sort of anatomy of the experimental results paper and talk a little bit more about a couple of other frequently asked questions that I have received from potential authors. The first one is sort of this broad question about why experimental results? Why would I want to publish an experimental result versus sort of a traditional, more well-known journal? And also, because this is a new journal, should I be concerned about impact factor? So my take on this, and as a person who's also published with experimental results, is to remind people that experimental results is not intended to replace the traditional journal format. If you have an article, a publication, a data set, an experiment that really is already suitable for the traditional journal format, go ahead and submit it there. We're not trying to disguise a traditional manuscript as an experimental results manuscript. This journal is really a new type of journal that is providing a venue to publish data sets that will not otherwise be captured elsewhere. So really what we're trying to do is provide a venue to take those data sets that are sitting on your computer, sitting in your file cabinet, that would not have a home, that would not be shared elsewhere. This is the venue for that. So it's really enhancing the traditional journal format rather than replacing it. The other interesting thing that has come up is that this journal seems to be, or this journal format seems to be facilitating an increase in communication among scientists. So it seems that the length of this journal is enough of a conversation starter, or it's enough information to generate interest that then will initiate dialogue among scientists. So, you know, it's a tidbit or it's a small chunk of data that can help demonstrate commonalities between research groups and findings, and that is increasing the dialogue outside of the journal format. So what I'd like to do now at this point is stop and pass this along to Ben Walther, who is an author who's published in experimental results, so that he can provide his perspective on the journal.
Great, thanks, Jenny. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my author perspective, and my paper was the one that you were just watching for the anatomy. So you saw a little bit of a peek into it. And for some context, that was a study that was a pilot study. We were funded by a regional agency that supports projects that investigate important, in this case, coastal issues to our area. So they're really looking to kickstart research, and that becomes important for why we chose to publish in this journal. So it was pilot. It was a smaller scale type of work. The budget was modest, but it allowed us to get some things rolling on some ideas that we had that we really wanted to investigate. That in this case, we were looking at oysters in coastal environments, and we were looking at geochemical records in their shells, and we were also looking at tying environmental dynamics to pathogen prevalence in oysters. So there's ecological meaning to that. There's also relevance to stakeholders, restoration, shell fisheries, all sorts of different aspects of this that could be potentially important to a broad audience. So just the components of the project that we were working on, it had both field and laboratory components. We were collecting samples out in the wild. We were measuring water parameters and so on. And then we were also bringing things back to the lab and making measurements. So there were a variety, even with the pilot project, there were a variety of components to this project. It was a mensurative study. It was not manipulative. So from my perspective, the experimental part of the experimental results is broad enough that it can contain both truly manipulative experiments as well as mensurative ones where we were comparing different locations that might have different environmental settings and seeing if the ecological responses were divergent. In our cases, they weren't. We were expecting to see a difference between our two study sites because of the sort of a priori guesses that we had about the environmental dynamics in these areas, but we didn't see that. So it was technically negative, and that's how we categorized our paper, but it was still really important because it told us some information about how these systems are working and is allowing us to refine our hypotheses for future work. So I think, as everyone's been saying, that this was a really important venue for us to get that information out there and say, we hypothesized X, but we actually didn't see that difference that we were expecting, but that can inform our refined work as we move forward with this. So I just want to echo what some people have been saying about the importance of this. Getting a peer-reviewed publication out of this study, even though we didn't necessarily see what we expected, is important. We think that that's a valuable contribution to the literature and also is a foundation for future work. The inclusion of the mandatory data linkage, I think, is also a really important aspect and one that the entire scientific community seems to be pushing for. Open data sharing. So not only are you summarizing your results in the paper, but you're linking to the actual data set. So there can be meta-analyses or other kinds of comparisons that could take place down the road. One of the things that I do want to highlight for sure is that the agency that funded us has an interest in seeing products out, and particularly for these types of smaller scale projects, that often just results in a project report back to the agency. And that's not always accessible by people outside of that small community. So this is a way to make sure that those results are more widely available to everybody else. And also, I think the agencies really appreciate this, that there's an additional product, there's a peer-reviewed publication that comes out of the report, the work that they funded. And I think that's really important to demonstrate to them that you are using their funds appropriately and also getting products out there that highlights what they are funding and what they are supporting. And as I mentioned, this particular agency and this particular study has a lot of stakeholders. So there's something else that we can point to when we're talking to diverse audiences, that here's the initial results and we've had these published, and here's our initial thoughts about why it did or didn't work. And that lays the groundwork for future proposals and future projects. And that is also the primary goal of this sort of pilot project scenario. You generate some initial results, you start some work, and then you can use those as a foundation to then apply for either with other agencies or other sources of support to really say, we need to take this to the next step, and here's our initial publication, and here's how we would refine our hypotheses moving forward. So this peer-reviewed publication is a linchpin for that kind of growth and pushing forward the scientific field to expand it. And if we didn't have this peer-reviewed publication, we'd only be able to refer to the agency report, but then the grant reviewers couldn't access it. So all of those were really informing why we were very happy to find this journal at an appropriate time that we could submit our paper for publication. As you saw in the anatomy of the paper, it is abbreviated. So scientists are conditioned to write sort of in this traditional journal format, which tends to be consistent largely across a lot of different journals. This one has similar components and sections, but they are shorter. So there's a little bit of a mental reconfiguration to how you're writing in this particular format, which is mostly trying to pare down and think about what is the most important, what are the real key messages, and in a way you're distilling down, I found, in preparing this manuscript, you're distilling down to the sort of highlights and to the primary things, both the objectives, why you were doing this work, your methods, your results, and the sort of primary outcomes that you found or didn't find. So it was a little bit of a, as I said, a reconfiguration of how we approached it, but I found it useful in that it was helpful to streamline in a way a lot of the extraneous information, just say, here's the study and here's what we found. And it ends up being a very straightforward type of paper to write. One of the last things I would ping on is that this project was highly interdisciplinary. So this was actually bringing together myself and another faculty member, Dr. Jeff Turner here at my institution. And I am a coastal ecologist who works with, among other things, geochemical isotopic proxies. And he is works with pathogens, and we had never worked together before, and this was a venue for us to try a project out together, try to put our tools together, and also publish together. And so that was really valuable to get a product out like that that's highly interdisciplinary. And it also demonstrates we happen to be at the same university, so in our annual evaluations, we have a product to point to say, not only are we being productive, but we're collaborating, and here's evidence of that. And also related to that is we had 5 authors, and 3 of them were students. One of them was a graduate student, and 2 of them were actually undergraduate students that had been working with us this past summer on this project. And so this was the very first publication that they have. And so it was a really useful venue to be able to make sure that students that are working with us, particularly on sort of shorter term timescales like a summer internship or a semester research project that they might be getting school credit for, but they're also getting a peer-reviewed publication out of it with their names as co-authors, which is incredibly valuable to them for their future careers. So all of those were really advantages to us of why we chose to publish in this journal, and why we were happy that we got it done. So I think that pretty much finishes my thoughts. So I will stop and pass us on to the next section.
Great. Thank you, Ben, and thank you to all our speakers. That was fantastic hearing from everybody's different perspectives. Ben, I think you still got your webcam on, just in case you hadn't turned it off yet. Fantastic. So I hope you enjoyed hearing from our different panelists there, and hopefully you'll have thought of some questions popping into your head as they've been talking. So now we're going to move on to our Q&A. So please, we'd like to invite you to submit your questions into the chat box, and they'll come through to us, and then we can pass them on to our panelists and they can answer them and have a discussion. So we'll give you a few minutes to submit your questions, and whilst you're doing that, while we wait, we've had some pre-submitted questions in. So I'm just going to ask the panelists some of these while you will have a think and submit your own questions in the chat box. So let's start with a question for, I think, for Ali. What is your turnaround time for peer review?
So we would like to eventually get to the stage where we're receiving reviews in about 1 to 2 weeks. It's currently taking a little longer than this, but we're hoping that the time will be reduced as we get more and more editorial board members in place to help with reviewing across the different subject areas.
Brilliant, thank you. Great. So while we're waiting, please do submit your questions if you have them. We'd really love to hear from you while we have everyone together. Okay, so a question for Ben, I think now. Did you find it a difficult decision to publish in EXP with it being such a new journal?
No, mostly because, well, all of the advantages that I was talking about, and really we had no other option, as I think was mentioned by one of the comments. You know, these smaller data sets, there's not really any place to put them anywhere else for peer review. So we became aware of this journal, and we were really excited because otherwise we would not have gotten a publication out of it at all. It would have had to been wrapped up with future work, and we're not sure whether we're going to get the funding for it yet. So this was sort of an ideal format and venue, and we didn't have another option. So it was a very easy decision.
Great, thank you, Ben. Okay. We have another question for Cambridge. So for Fiona and Ali, I don't know if either or both of you would like to take this one. But somebody's asked, if the journal doesn't have an impact factor, what's the motivation for people to write and submit to it? Oh, Fiona, sorry, I think you're on mute. Easy mistake.
Okay, thank you for that. To be honest, I think Jenny and Ben said it a whole lot better than I ever could. Jenny focused on the fact that articles published in experimental results are solid scientific studies. Ask yourself, does it contribute to the scientific records? This is a new type of journal where the data sets are not captured elsewhere, and it actually enhances the traditional journal format. Ben said that it allows, these small snippets of research allows you to refine the hypothesis. It enables people to publish research that then doesn't lead to being replicated elsewhere by somebody else who doesn't know that you've done that research. So it's actually filling in the scientific record, and I think publishing there for those reasons is really important.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so we don't have any questions in on the chat box yet, but we still have a few, so I'll just keep talking through, and please feel free to submit your questions, as I said. So I think a question for Jenny this time. Are there any disciplines or areas of research that you would love to be getting submissions from in the future?
I'm going to try my webcam again here. Hopefully it'll be, hold on. We don't have any pre-prescribed notions of what kinds of papers we would like to receive, but we've been really delighted at the papers that have been submitted. So I would just really encourage anyone who thinks that they might have a paper or a data set or paper idea that would be suitable for the environmental science section of experimental results. If you'd like, please reach out to me and I can help provide some feedback of whether your data set is appropriate, or maybe if it's appropriate for another section of experimental results. So we really are open to all types of science, whether it's experimental, whether it's modeling, simulations, etc. that fit within the environmental science topic area.
Great, thank you, Jenny. Okay, we have a question about data storage. So again, Ali or Fiona, I don't know if one of you would like to take this, but is there a preference for the types of data storage repositories that people should be using?
Sorry, just bear with me. So on the experimental results website, we do recommend a few general repositories such as Dryad, Zenodo, Figshare, and Dataverse. But ultimately, the choice is up to the author. I would say, though, that it is important for data to be stored in a repository that will store the data for the long term to ensure that it remains available. And more formal repositories like the ones I've just mentioned do ensure this. So that's something to bear in mind.
Great, thank you, Ali. And I think probably another one for you here as well.
Okay.
How do you handle instances where readers challenge the comments of reviewers, as all reviewers are openly available for everyone to read?
So we state really clearly on the website that open peer review does not mean that the reviewers that people should contact either the reviewers or the authors directly about what's said, and that and the instructions also say that any queries should come to me. So yeah, it's not sort of an invitation for an open forum discussion on what people's thoughts are on the paper. Particularly in terms of the authors wanting to comment on what the reviewers have said, it should all come through me.
Brilliant, thank you, Ali. Ali, sorry, I don't know where Ali came from. And we've got two final questions that were pre-submitted. So last call for questions in the chat box. But just one more for you, Ali, while you're still on camera.
Okay.
How does the OA fee compare to that of a traditional length manuscript? Is there any difference?
Oh, I think Fiona, I don't know whether this might be something you're better answering.
Okay.
Sure. Well, normally for sort of longer journal articles, for example, our hybrid journals, the fee is nearly £2,000, which is $2,500. So that's generally what the fee is. For experimental results, the fee is $750, and if you you're a reviewer, you can get a discount off for doing 2 reviews, so you can get a £300 discount off that $750 fee if you've done 2 reviews. So it's actually substantially quite different to a standard open access fee. I mean, they can vary dramatically. Some journals are charging a really high fee, up to $6,000. Others are slightly lower. So it varies immensely, but actually for experimental results, it's really low. And the reason that we've got discounts is because we want to recognize the reviewers and what they're doing as part of the community. And we kind of want it to be a feedback loop where people, the reviewers for articles, and then they want to publish their own articles. So I think it's really important to recognize their contribution.
Thanks, Fiona. Great. So we've got our last question that's come in, and I think this one is for Ben again. So Ben, was it difficult to cover everything you wanted to say in such a short format?
Not difficult. I guess, as I mentioned, it was you have to write a little bit differently. You have to streamline your thoughts and really distill the important points. And I will note, as Jenny said, that there is supplementary material. So, and you can also, I believe we linked to some external information associated with the data set. There was also a bit of an expansion on some of the methods. So there were some of those venues that we could elaborate where we needed. But it did take a little bit of thinking slightly differently to try to write in a shorter format, but that also tended to fit the shorter scope of the entire project. So at the end of the day, we felt that it was well matched, that the word limits were not overly constraining.
Great, thank you, Ben. Fantastic. So if there are no other questions to come in, I hope that those pre-submitted questions have covered quite a broad range and answered anything that you might have had. So that brings us to the end of our webinar today. I really hope that you've all enjoyed it and found it informative and useful as well for the discussion and hearing from different perspectives, from publisher to editor to author. And I'd really like to thank all of our panelists, so Fiona, Ali, Jenny and Ben today for taking part. As I mentioned earlier, you will have an email in the next couple of days that with these slides and the recording, so you're able to watch this back. And you'll notice on the slides that all of our panelists have included their contact details as well. So should you like to reach out to anybody to discuss anything further about experimental results or the environmental science area, please do that. Everyone would love to hear from you if you have questions. Oh, I think we've just had a last question come in. Okay, thank you, Gregory. So Gregory has just asked, and this might be one for Jenny. Could you clarify, Jenny, is it 2,000 words for each section in the manuscript or for the entire paper?
Sure, yeah, it's 2,000 words for the entire paper. So, we're not going to go and count every word, but that is what we're shooting for. And again, remember that this is not designed to take a traditional scientific paper and try to whittle it down to fit the experimental results model. What we're really trying to do is capture those studies that necessitate this shorter form narrative. And so we have those typical sections that you would have in a normal scientific manuscript, but they're going to be a lot shorter. So you may have just a paragraph of introduction, a paragraph of methods, conclusion, etc. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Gregory. Great. So as I was saying, you'll receive an email with the slide deck that you've seen today, the recording of the webinar, and everyone's details. So and as well as just a short survey about today's webinar. So I really hope that everyone has found that useful. And if you have any further questions that you think of, please do reach out to one of the team. We'll be more than happy to hear from you. Thank you very much.